Let's talk about peasants. So, at this point, we've talked a little bit about the first three tiers of this pyramid of feudalism. Okay, it's a hierarchy. So, obviously, the king is at the top, he controls everything. Now, if you notice, I've created this particular graphic for you. I need you to go back to Canvas, copy the graphic, and put it into your notebook before we even start. So I'm going to pause, or you pause, to get that in there so that we can have a good discussion or a good conversation about it. At this point, put that in. Okay, so hopefully you've already included this into your feudalism part of your notebook. This graphic is really special. It includes all the information and what you need to know about each of the different groups of people that we have encountered or will encounter when we talk about feudalism and this government structure. So at the top, there are kings. They control it all. They control all of the land, they control all of the money. Now, a step down from the kings are nobles. We've talked about this. Nobles control the land for the king. They've been given a fief by the king to maintain, and that is over time been passed down from generation to generation. They will collect taxes for the king. So you need to understand taxes is going to be an important part of this. The same thing with the opposite side, the clergy. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time later this week discussing briefly who the clergy are, but know that they control land, but they control the land for God. So the land that they've been given has been given to them by God. They also collect taxes. We're going to actually have a whole unit on that when we get back from Christmas vacation. We've spent a lot of time up to this point talking about the next two groups of people, knights and vassals. Both of them work for a more powerful lord. They're still considered part of the nobility, they're just a lesser lord. They may be a third or second, maybe even a fifth generation son who hasn't been given the land to maintain. So they need to go out and find another fief, or they need to become a knight and swear their loyalty, their allegiance, uh, swear an oath to protect the people and land of another landowner. So both of those are really important. Today, we're going to spend our time talking about the biggest and the last tier of our triangle, which are called peasants. Peasants are at the very bottom. And so in your notebook, I want you to make sure after this graphic, you type in life of a peasant. A peasant is a vocabulary word. So make sure that that's red and bolded. A peasant is the lowest part of a government structure. In this case, the least powerful people in this government structure. If you notice, I've given you these kind of arrows. And so the peasants are going to give money to the knights or the vassals, who will then give money to the nobles or the clergy, who will then give money to the king. The king gives land, gives land, gives land. They don't really own the land, they're still maintaining the land. Just like the king controls all the land. They just kind of maintain it. So let's talk a little bit about some statistics about our good friends, the peasants. A peasant, about 95% of our total population were peasants at the time, anywhere from 95 to 99. It was an incredibly large amount of people who were at that bottom level. So once you got, if you were lucky enough to be in the top three tiers of our pyramid, you definitely wanted to stay there, because the very bottom, this is the worst of the worst. And on top of that, very rarely were you able to get out of your group, out of your tier of people and move higher up. So you didn't want to be a peasant. Peasant life was really kind of gross. Most peasants lived in isolated villages by themselves. Now make sure you're writing this stuff down in your notebook. So these villages were isolated, which means they didn't see a lot of people. Only about 100 people uh, made up a village. It was not very big, and they were cut off from everybody else. So when Charlemagne gave the land to his most loyal soldiers, they developed these little kind of like pocket communities on this land. And so being a peasant, you were probably born there, lived there, and died there. You very rarely got the opportunity to go out and travel. In fact, it's kind of like imagine living in Titusville and not knowing that Pleasantville or Centerville even exist. That's kind of how isolated they were. As I said, there are typically fewer than 100 people in your village. You only knew about 100 people in your lifetime. So population wasn't very large, but of that, 95% of that were peasants. Imagine only knowing 100 people in your lifetime. First of all, there are more than 100 people in your grade. So if you can identify someone as being from your grade, you already know more than 100 people. Some of you claim to have a whole bunch of people who follow you on Instagram or in Snapchat. That is even outrageous to someone who would be a peasant. They could not even possibly imagine what that would be like. There are two kinds of peasants, and if we go back a second um, to our graphic here, there are freemen and there are serfs. So both of these are peasants. So when we say peasants, we're talking about this whole tier of people. There are two types of peasants. They are serfs and freemen. You need to get this information into your notebook. Okay? Two types of peasants, serfs and freemen. Serfs, write this down, bound to the land. Serfs were bound to the land. They couldn't leave. They were stuck there. So, number one thing about serfs, they're bound to the land. Number two thing about serfs is that they were unskilled labor, generally farmers. So, underneath this bullet, you want to put in a little bullet, and then you want to make sure that you write serfs and then have the two things about a serf. Number one, they were bound to the land, couldn't leave. And number two, they were generally unskilled labor. Freemen, on the other hand, could leave when they wanted to. Okay, so write that in your notebook. They could leave when they wanted. The difference is that there weren't very many places for them to go. They really didn't leave very often. However, freemen were skilled laborers. These are people who learned a craft from someone else. They would be people like millers who would mill grain into flour. They could be cobblers, people who made shoes. They could be silversmiths or blacksmiths, people who took work with metal. These are the jobs that freemen would have, a skilled labor job. So serfs are unskilled, generally farmers, and then freemen had some sort of skill. Now, generally, serfs would work 3 days on their land and 3 days for the land of the Lord. So the Lord would give them land that they could farm. This is also true with freemen, by the way, but land that they could farm. And generally, they worked on their land. They did their thing for 3 days. And then the other 3 days, they did whatever they needed to for the Lord. Obviously, that's only 6 days. On the seventh day, everybody was required to go to church. That was not an exception. You had to go. Now, over time, what happened was we saw a lot less working for themselves and a lot more working for the Lord. And so over time, these people couldn't leave. They had no money. They were bound to the landowner. They either owed him money or they had become indentured servants. There was a constant threat of famine. They didn't have a lot of money and they didn't have a lot of food. And if their crops failed, they couldn't go to the grocery store. There was no place for them to go to get food. And so everything on their village, everything in their location, they were self-sufficient, self-contained. If they wanted it, they had to make it. And unfortunately, if something happened to their crops, they had a lot of people die. Everyone drank ale, and everyone had parasites. Two things that Mr. Herman is going to cover more for you tomorrow. But go ahead and get that into your notebook right now. Ale was a very, very weak version of beer, typically made with barley or sometimes honey. Uh, Fermented honey makes mead. That was really popular at the time, but both of which were drank. They drank these weak alcoholic beverages because water wasn't good. A lot of cases it had even more parasites in it. So here's a graphic. Now this graphic is going to be important because your quiz is going to be based off of this graphic. You can see that this is actually a calendar of peasant life. So, starting with January and working our way through to December, this is what peasants would do on their land over and over again. And so they would go through, and they each month was something that they needed to focus on that was different. And in each case, uh, they were working a lot for the Lord and not for themselves. And so life as a peasant was just not good. They lived in these thatch roof huts. I would like you to write that into your notebook. They lived in thatched roof huts. Thatched. Thatched. It is a system of overlaying straw, and so they would live in these thatched roof huts. As you can see, it's not very fancy. You were given your house by the Lord. The Lord controlled all of the housing, and you had to live where He told you to live. It wasn't very pretty. If you notice, if you go back to Canvas for a second, you will notice that I actually gave you this graphic right here. Go ahead and copy that graphic and put that into your notebook. This is a typical peasant house. And in this case, you can see the thatched roof. It has straw that's laid on top of each other so that hopefully the rain would slide down the thatched roof. There are a couple of things that I want you to add. You can either add these as text boxes around the graphic, or you can add them as on the side as part of our notes. But a couple of things. Number one, peasants didn't go to school. You might think that that's fantastic. They learned everything they needed to know from their parents. By the time that they could walk, they were working. It was a really tough life. Life expectancy of peasants was not very long, and somewhere in the 20s, 20 to 30 range was life expectancy. If you made it through the first couple years of your life, you were lucky. And so they spent a lot of time working and not very much time in school. Their houses, the walls of their house were made of something called wattle and daub, which is a weaving of straw, of sticks. And then in between the weaving, they would actually pack mud in there. And so wattle and daub, definitely add that to your notebook as well. Animals would sleep in your house, just like we talked with the Vikings. It gave you a place, gave you some extra warmth, but also made sure that no one stole your livestock. Most peasant houses had straw floor. They had straw beds. Because of all of this straw that was around, every peasant all the time had lice or fleas of some sort. Um, they had one pair of clothes, really. They slept in those clothes, they worked in those clothes. They didn't really have a lot of extras, maybe one pair of shoes. It was a very, very awful, awful life. Peasants would bathe generally one time a year because it took too long for them to actually heat up water. The dad would bathe first, followed by the most important men of the family, followed by all of the children, and then followed by the wife. So by the time the wife got into the tub, it was definitely not clean water. Definitely not clean water. Ooh, don't go too far here. Lots of interesting facts about peasants. Peasants had a very difficult life. I hope that you kind of get a picture of what that would be like. We cannot possibly imagine what they went through. They worked 7 days a week from sun up to sundown. If their crops failed, they starved. If they got sick, they died. Um, Generally, women died in childbirth. Um, it was not a good life. And every peasant longed to be something else. Eventually, they're going to pull themselves out of being peasants, and we're going to establish a middle class. Right now, we only have an upper class, which would be the lords, and a lower class, which would be peasants. Eventually, we're going to establish that middle class, but at this time, it wasn't they weren't able to do that. So here's your next thing. I need you to do your quiz on peasant jobs. If you watch the video, you will know that the peasant, um, the super secret answer is that the piece of paper is designed as a calendar. Each one is represents a month of of a job that they would do that month. Okay, good luck on that. And tomorrow, Mr. Herman is going to talk all about parasites, one of his favorite things. We'll see ya.